I will explain a little bit more about why I don't have an American accent in a minute. But let me just start by painting a picture of some of the kinds of concrete issues that are the subject of my talk today. And I will just put my timer on so that I am aware of the time. A pregnant woman, oh, hang on, how do I control? Oop. There? Okay. A pregnant woman and her partner are trying to decide whether to proceed with a pregnancy after amniocentesis has shown that the fetus has a genetic variant associated with a significant increase in the risk for autism and schizophrenia. A professional organisation of physicians is trying to decide whether to recommend that its member clinics across the nation open their fertility medicine practices to gay men seeking to have a child, knowing that children born to these men will not have a mother. A funder of research is trying to decide whether to allocate money to projects that use stem cells taken from early human embryos. A biotech company is deciding whether to expand the genetic tests it sells to IVF patients to include genes associated with disabling but not life-threatening traits like abnormal genitalia or achondroplasia, which is a dwarfism. A government is deciding whether citizens should have access to in vitro fertilization as part of the basic package of medical care available to all. And if they do provide access, whether it should be restricted in any way. Should the number of treatment rounds be restricted to 2 or 3? Or should the number of embryos transferred be limited? Will the package include payments for sperm and egg donors? These are just 5 examples of decisions in the area sometimes called beginning of life. They are all real decisions that have been made by individuals, by companies, by professional bodies, by research funders, and by nations. They were all occasioned by advances in technology. Without these advances, that particular decision would not have arisen. Were they difficult decisions? Not all of these decisions were difficult for the decision makers themselves. For some people and groups, the appropriate response to these dilemmas were and are obvious. Perhaps the couple readily agreed not to terminate the pregnancy, or the funder easily committed to funding the research, or the government readily agreed to cover IVF subject to certain conditions. But even if the decision makers themselves knew what they should do, in many cultures and nations across the world, these were and often remain difficult decisions because they are publicly contested. They often require of the decision maker an account of his or her analysis of the moral or ethical issues at stake, and they require reasons for the decision. Why is this so? And what, if anything, can bioethics offer to help individuals and societies addressing these and related decisions around the beginning of life? So that's what I'm here to help open up for today. Before I say more about these and other difficult decisions around the beginning of life, and because I'm the first speaker today, I want to say something about myself and the field in which I work, so that I can situate my remarks today in a professional and personal context. I am not you, obviously, and the subject matter of this session, the title of my lecture, may not mean the same thing to you as it does to me. That's fine. But I want to acknowledge the potential for this difference and to invite you to consider my remarks not as sweeping truth claims about the moral significance of the beginning of life or the best way to think through complex bioethics issues, but as the perspective of one person who works in this area in one particular context. So I just wanted to try to give you a little bit of the view from where I stand, I'm calling it. So this is actually the view right now from my hotel room here in Hong Kong. It's so beautiful, I had to photograph it 1,000,000 times. But this is my usual view, so it's also pretty nice. This is in winter. But it's not the view that I was accustomed to looking at when I was born either. So I'm a New Zealander, just to get it out there now you know. I was born and raised in New Zealand, and my formal education took place there. New Zealand is where I was trained, first in law and then bioethics. New Zealand, with its specific history, culture, and social debates, and many of those are not dissimilar from the history and culture of Hong Kong, but they are also not the same. This was my initial frame of reference, and the law was my first analytic framework. Yet I have worked for the past 13 years in North America, so here I am, particularly in the United States, not as a lawyer, but as a bioethics researcher. So I am steeped in American bioethics and in how bioethics debates are framed and debated in the US. This is so even though I will likely always be an outsider in the US. They, like you, hear first my New Zealand accent whenever I open my mouth. They always ask me, how long have you been here? I'm like, 13 years. But even though I seek to retain a critical distance from the so-called American approach, and we can talk about what that is, I'm deeply embedded within it right now, and I have to acknowledge that. Insofar as there is such a thing as American bioethics or an American approach, then this has in all likelihood become my approach. So while that was the view from my hotel room and this is the view from my office, and I have a Kiwi accent, I'm a mixture of all of these contexts. So I'm going to move on a little bit from like where I'm coming from to talk what about this thing bioethics. So every person in this room can probably give a different account of what bioethics is and why it matters. But let me try, since I'm the first speaker. Bioethics is, as I see it, a field of inquiry focused on identifying, understanding, and, where possible, addressing the ethical implications of medicine and science. It's a place, an intellectual place, where it is legitimate to ask not only what is happening and why, but also who is affected and how, and most importantly, given what we know, what ought to be done and why. Indeed, asking that ought kind of question, which is a normative question in philosophy terms, is required in bioethics, even if not having a crisp, universal answer to this question is not always possible, or even, I would argue, always desirable. Methodologically, bioethics is both multi and interdisciplinary, and I use those two words with some distinction. Multidisciplinary, because it has recognised from the very beginning, which is actually only the late 1960s, so not that long ago, it has always recognised that no single area of inquiry or experience, no one discipline, can fully explain or understand an issue, let alone decide what should be done. Many voices must be present simply so that we can learn enough to identify and address the questions. And it's interdisciplinary, since building new knowledge in bioethics requires not just learning from a variety of disciplines, but creating new knowledge with these diverse experts, creating an analysis that transcends a single discipline and is understandable and meaningful across disciplines and perspectives, and is translatable to the public. So I'm going to steal a little bit here from Alistair Campbell, who has recently written a highly accessible book. It was published in 2013 called Bioethics, the Basics, and I commend it to you if you need an introduction to the field. It's very readable, it's quite short, and very easy to understand. And he puts it somewhat like this. I'm stealing and paraphrasing from Alistair, so if I get it right, you can thank him. If I get it wrong, you can blame me. Bioethical inquiry begins with the facts. Since, and this is Alistair speaking now, we cannot base valid ethical judgments on inaccurate or inadequate information. It bears saying that it may be obvious, but you'd be surprised how often it happens anyway. It is therefore essential that scientific and medical experts are involved in bioethics research. What are embryonic stem cells? Where do they come from? How can they be used in medical research? These are factual questions. Add to this social scientists who can help us understand the social and political and cultural contexts that shape decisions and debates, and can provide data on practices and opinions of clinicians or patients or other stakeholders. And then you have to add what Alistair calls clinical wisdom, the insights of physicians and nurses and other professionals who have years of experience treating patients and who understand the realities of the clinical encounter. I might add the need sometimes for lawyers to explain what the law tells us, or religious persons to explain theological approaches. These and other experts may need a seat at the table. From all of this and more, we can gain a rich and complex understanding of what is happening, to whom, and to some extent, why. But as Campbell goes on to explain, this is just the first step. While these facts are the foundation for a bioethics analysis, bioethics is at its core about wrestling with questions not simply about what is, but what ought to be, and with exploring the moral justifications for actions, policies, and practices. So, if you like, bioethics step 2, you take what is, and you reach for now moral theories to help you understand what ought to be. Moral philosophy offers to bioethics a number of different ways of thinking through ought questions. There are different moral theories, and they draw on a variety of philosophical approaches. Campbell surveys them in his book, Utilitarianism, Deontology, Virtue Ethics, Ethics of Care. Although some bioethics scholars commit themselves to a single moral theory, which is what has traditionally been understood to be required for philosophers, and these people analyse problems from a strictly consequentialist approach or a strictly deontological perspective, I would argue that the field of bioethics overall takes a much more ecumenical approach to moral theory. If this seems sloppy to philosophers, and I think it sometimes does, maybe sometimes is, at its best it represents an acknowledgement that all moral theories offer important insights into the human condition and are all useful conceptual tools for thinking about normative questions. But no single approach will always sufficiently capture the richness of what is at stake, nor can one approach reliably act as the only guide for deciding what ought to be done. One result of recognising that multiple competing moral theories may be useful for guiding action was the development in the 1970s of 4 principles to guide bioethics decision-making. These principles are not rooted in one particular moral theory, or they're not tied tightly to it. They're intended to be practical decision-making aids rather than standalone moral theories. They were developed in the context of biomedical research involving human subjects. And they were to guide policy and practice in that area, but they've been applied to other areas in bioethics as well. And they are respect for autonomy, beneficence, which is the principle of helping others, non-maleficence, which means refraining from harming others, and justice, seeking to enhance equality and promote fairness. You may have heard that American bioethics is all about autonomy, that this is the only principle used to guide action. And while it does get a lot of attention in the US for historical and cultural reasons, it is not always the only thing that should or does indeed matter, even there. So, however, as useful as these 4 principles can be, and they often point in different directions, an account of why one or more is favoured over others is still required by the decision maker, even after applying them. So in terms of doing bioethics, we take the information about what is, the facts, we apply or look for insight from moral theories, including the principles I just laid out. And from this, we develop an analysis which should identify and describe what is at stake in a given debate, analyse the arguments on the various sides, and if possible, make recommendations for action. Those recommendations may be policies or practices, laws or social norms, and we provide reasons for our decisions. And that is how we get to what ought to be. So applying this process to our stem cell research example, we can see that after learning the facts, we still don't know why it might or might not be acceptable to go ahead with embryonic stem cell research. We can look to moral theory to learn about this ought question, about the significance of the facts. What does it matter that the stem cells are taken from an early human embryo which is destroyed in the process? What is the value of that very earliest form of human life? What does it mean to respect it? And what does it mean to respect it, if that is indeed required? Religions, of course, have also considered these questions in a philosophical way in many cases. and they may also be relevant at this stage. But because bioethics is, in many countries at least, a secular undertaking, it is often necessary to say more about a moral question than to refer simply to one's religious approach. Although the reasoning from the religion may be translatable into a secular discourse, that translation is still required. There are some areas in bioethics where the ought questions are no longer difficult in the sense that they have been widely agreed upon. In the US, for example, the question whether competent adult patients ought to be allowed to refuse to receive or continue receiving life-sustaining treatment has been decided in favour of them allowing them to do so. I say decided in the legal sense, for it has been confirmed by the courts, but I also mean in the ethical sense, because in the US at least, the morality of recognising this right is rarely, although not all, it is sometimes debated, but it is rarely debated. There is broad acceptance of the argument that at the end of the day, the moral principle of respect for persons requires allowing them to make this choice. But there are other ought questions that remain wide open in the US and in other countries, and some that have felt as though they were resolved but now are beginning to reopen again. This is certainly happening around the beginning of life. It's our job as bioethicists, my job as a bioethics researcher, to raise, discuss and address these unanswered questions. And I want to acknowledge that it can be scary. My responses will be contested. Things I say will not be agreed upon by others. I may not reach final conclusions. People often look to me, to bioethicists, for answers, just as we look to judges for decisions. But we may sometimes give those answers, but we give them less frequently than judges do. Sometimes the most valuable contribution from a bioethicist is not the answers they give, but the questions they raise and the framing they give for thinking them through. So let's look a little bit more specifically at beginning of life. I asked myself to answer this question: why does beginning of life matter? Why is it an important area in bioethics? So let me just state the obvious, maybe. Creating children is creating new morally relevant beings. It is how we continue the human species, sure, but it is also how we enlarge or replenish our moral community. It is the only time when we make another someone who will have independent moral worth. It is also a major focus of the meaning in many people's lives. Having and raising children provides significant meaning to many people, and it is therefore morally significant just because of what it means to others. What we do when we create and raise children has an impact on ourselves and on the communities and societies in which we live. It starts simply enough with this little egg being fertilized by sperm, tiny egg and even tinier sperm. At least that's how it's usually done. Science is trying to change that. Human life begins in a second, but then it develops gradually over days, weeks, months, even years. It is not in doubt that a fertilized human egg is alive and human, as in it's not some other species. But then begins a gradual biological process, as first an embryo, then a fetus develops, and a child is born and raised. What is the moral significance of these phases? How do we make sense of a gradual process like this? It is hotly debated how to understand this process, illustrated on the slide. The significance of the fertilized human egg, the embryo that it quickly becomes, the fetus it goes on to be, the newborn baby that hopefully results. We have long recognised that we can have an impact on the reproductive process. Before the egg is fertilised, we can control whose egg and whose sperm. We can prevent fertilisation from happening. Initially, we didn't have very good tools for this. We could prevent sex, but over time, various ways have emerged for preventing conception. And we can end pregnancy. It is only recent that preventing conception and ending pregnancy have become safe and reliable, but they are old goals and creating old dilemmas. For many of the same reasons that creating children is morally significant, preventing the creation of children, preventing new life or ending it very early in the process is also a morally significant activity. although exactly how morally significant and why is debated. But there are also reasons why this area of human life and activity is important that go beyond the fact that this is how we create new morally relevant beings. Reproduction is, for the time being anyway, until science finds a way around it, embodied by women. It happens in our bodies in a demanding, exhausting, time-intensive way. So controlling or not controlling reproduction has a huge and direct impact on the lives of women. There is, of course, a long history of women having very little control over their ability to have or prevent children, and of women being persecuted on account of either not having enough children, having too many children, or having children who are deemed not good enough. Women have been held to account for reproduction, and their lives have been tied to it for millennia. So there's a long history of debate over whether and for what reasons women should be able to prevent conception and terminate pregnancies. There is also a long history of governments trying to control who reproduces and how many children they have. We saw this, of course, in the 20th century when American and then German governments enacted eugenics programs. And of course, you have seen it nearby with more recent efforts by a government not selecting who should reproduce, but restricting how many children each woman should have. The history of government involvement in reproduction is long and complex in the US and in many other nations. So just as the role of women in reproduction and the history around that raises the moral intensity of this debate, so does the involvement of governments. Technology puts a new spin on these old questions of who should reproduce, why and when and how. Who should be born? How much control should we exercise? But for now, let me say that I hope it is fair to say that the beginning of life is morally significant, both because it's a process that leads to the creation of a new human being, a new person, but also because it is embodied by women, and thus it affects the life of an existing person, and because it has an enormous impact on the lives of families and the makeup of societies. A huge range of issues, ethical issues, fall out of this picture. And there may be some different issues here in Hong Kong than in the US, or they may play out here very differently than they play out in the US or in any other country. What are our preconception rights and duties? Should we prevent pregnancy and when? Should we end pregnancy and when? Are we obligated to be tested for the conditions that we may carry and pass on to our children? Who should reproduce? Who should be sterilised? How do we get pregnant? Does it matter how we get pregnant? Who should be pregnant for whom? What about surrogate mothers or egg donors or sperm donors? All of these issues around how we get pregnant and how we give birth, how we treat newborns, especially imperiled newborns, these are some of the many issues that fall out of this area. So I can't go through all of these issues. It would be exhausting to try to be so exhaustive. But I want to focus on 4 areas now inside of the beginning of life that I feel raise significant issues going forward. This is my list, and you may make a very different one. So the 4 continuing and emerging challenges that I see are around these 4 issues. One of them, the first, conception and abortion, may seem like old news. And it is in some ways. But because of the improvements in the safety and efficacy of contraception and abortion, and improvements especially in access to contraception and abortion, there are issues today about the impact of this improved access on fertility rates and the timing of procreation. So Mr. Yuen raised this question. This is largely perceived to be a good outcome. Women lead safer lives and have some control over when they have children and how many they have. It is better for the lives of women and documented to be better for the lives of children. But it is also having this level of control that we have is also having an impact on countries' fertility rates. So you see this in Europe and you see it here too. What will be the future of countries where fewer children are born than in the past? How do countries deal with those issues, and what, if any, role should government have in encouraging procreation or in encouraging the prevention? There's a second kind of issue that falls out of the contraception and abortion, the ability to use contraception and abortion, that in the US is very, very significant right now. So there is, surprisingly, continuing and worsening, actually, disagreement about whether women should have access to contraception and abortion. This may be surprising since in 1973, this US government in Roe v. Wade confirmed the right of women to access terminations of pregnancy subject to certain conditions. Decades earlier, the US Supreme Court had confirmed the right of women to access contraception. Yet today there is growing challenge to these rights in the US. This is a challenge driven primarily by certain religious views in the country, and it is surprising the impact that it is having on the lives of women. There has been a remarkable amount of legal activity in the US in the last 10 to 20 years, especially in the last 10 years, restricting access to abortion services and now restricting access to contraception. Laws have been passed requiring women to be provided with information, including having to listen to the fetal heartbeat and hear a description of the abortion process, that are said to be in order to provide information, but that they're actually designed to dissuade women from having terminations. New laws have been passed in many states about the width of corridors in abortion clinics or the admitting privileges of the physicians. The result of these laws has been that clinics have closed down. In some states, there are only 4 clinics providing terminations for millions of women. Recent Supreme Court decisions regarding the inclusion of contraceptives, not actually abortions, but contraceptives, in the package of health benefits required under the new Affordable Care Act, which you may know as Obamacare. The recent Supreme Court decisions have mean that health insurance, which is largely employer-provided in the US, does not have to include contraception if the employer has a deeply held religious objection to the provision of contraception. The legal and moral significance of this ongoing debate in the US cannot be underestimated. It may be very different in other countries, but it shows how debates around the beginning of life that can seem resolved can re-emerge with new vigour. The second area where I see significant activity is around assisted human reproduction. We are getting better at this. And as we get better at it, questions arise about who should have access to the treatments. Now that we can help infertile men and infertile women reproduce, questions arise around whether single men and gay couples should be helped to reproduce. Should older women whose natural fertility has decreased be helped to reproduce? Should couples with a history of genetic diseases be helped to reproduce this way? Should women who carry mitochondrial disease that they do not want to pass on to their children have access to advanced assisted reproductive technologies in order to not pass on those genes? As assisted human reproduction becomes more efficient and safer and more effective, questions arise about the use of donors, egg donors, sperm donors, embryo donors. Under what circumstances should they be allowed to donate? Should they be paid? And you may know that in the US, egg donors, there is no law around how much egg donors can be paid, and so significant amounts of money do change hands. There are other questions around access that I will touch on in a second in more detail. The third area, reproductive genetics, stems really from advances in genetics more generally. As we are able to do sequencing more easily, questions arise about how much we should look for. You'll hear more about this from the next speaker, and I will say more about it in a second, but let it just be stated for now that as advances in genetics, in the general field of genetics occur, questions arise in reproduction about what should be tested for and how those tests should be offered to women and patients. The third area where I see potential for significant ethical issues stems from advances in gene-environment research, specifically around epigenetics. We are learning more and more about how the fetal environment and the woman's body during pregnancy, her health status and her medical history, her surroundings, how all of that affects the later health of the child that she goes on to have, and even the grandchild that she may one day have. As we learn more and more about the environment in which, the relevance of the environment in which children grow up on their later health, this raises old questions about whose responsibility it is to protect children from harm, and whether anyone, pregnant women, parents, policymakers, have an obligation to take steps to minimise harm and, more controversially, maximise benefits. We already have research showing a correlation between obesity and later child health, obesity in the woman. And now it appears that those changes can be passed on not just from that obese mother to her child, but also to the grandchild. This raises questions about whose responsibility the woman's health is and her rights around reproduction, as well as her rights and autonomy during pregnancy. So I want to focus on two of those four larger areas that I just raised. Let me say something a little bit more about assisted human reproduction and then about prenatal and preconception genetic testing. And both of these now draw on my own specific work. So I started out really broad, and I'm trying to sort of end up getting to the things that I specifically have worked on. So I've done some work in assisted human reproduction, specifically around access to fertility treatments. And one of the reasons that I've looked at this, and I looked at it with my colleague Michael Gusmano, who's here, we looked at this together, is that in the United States, fertility treatment is associated with high rates of multiple birth. And we know that multiple births are more likely to be preterm and carry higher risks for the mother and for the child. So the question one question in the US that we were asked to look at was, is there anything that we can do to reduce the rates of multiple birth following fertility treatment? And not just anything we can do, like rules we could make, laws we could pass, but anything that it would be ethical to do, and to name the ethical concerns. So we did a project that tried to understand what drives rates of multiple birth. And it turns out that one of the things that drives in the US context is the fact that much fertility treatment is not covered by insurance, creating, in a way, perverse incentives for women undergoing treatment. In order to save yourself money and be able to afford treatment, you need to undertake the most aggressive treatment plan you can with the highest pregnancy rates. This means transferring 2 or 3 embryos in IVF treatment, and that is associated with high rates of multiple birth. So when we looked at this issue, we were trying to understand, in a way, who or what was really responsible for driving these rates? Was it the choices of women, or was it the policy context in which they were situated and the pressures on them? We just go to the second area of work that I've worked on, so I'm working on right now, which is looking at advances in reproductive genetic tests. So there are 2 places where genetic testing is becoming really important in this context, and one of them is in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is testing of embryos during the IVF process. The other is testing women who are already pregnant. So just to state the obvious, far more women are likely to be tested who are pregnant than embryos tested during IVF. In the US, 4 million women give birth a year. That's 4 million women who get prenatal care and could have prenatal genetic testing. Prenatal testing is evolving in 2 important ways. Now, following amniocentesis, you can do whole genome sequencing. So you can look for anything that we can look for in genetics. This raises questions about what should be looked for at this point, how the information should be given to patients, and what they should do as a result. We can test not just for life-threatening and severely disabling conditions, but also for genes that increase the risk of a disease. but make no guarantee of it. Genes that increase the risk of a disease that will come later in life, like Alzheimer's. And also genes associated with non-disease traits. So of course we can look for sex, but we can also look for some not particularly exciting genes associated with things like eye colour. But as you may know, there's significant research right now looking at the genetics of intelligence. So there's a real prospect that there will be genes identified said to be associated with intelligence, and they will be able to be tested for in amniocentesis. The second large development that's happening is that a non-invasive prenatal test available at 8 weeks gestation that requires simply a blood draw from the mother has been developed and is now already available. It can only test for some of the same conditions that we could screen for major chromosomal abnormalities. But the hope one day is to be able to do whole genome sequencing using this test. So these same questions about what we should test for will be arising at 8 weeks gestation, when pregnancies are very early and they are not publicly showing. This raises extremely difficult questions for clinicians, for policymakers, for individuals, and for society about what reasonable use would be and how to support that. There are lots of arguments, moral arguments, ethical arguments, about how we should decide what we should test for and how we should decide how tests should be offered and results returned. It's easy, I put to you, to say why it would be good to expand pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, prenatal testing, why it would be good to take more control over something that has otherwise been so uncontrollable, namely whether or not you go on to have a child with a particular genetic condition. Parenting is hard enough without the problems of a genetic disease or disorder. Testing allows prospective parents to protect themselves from additional heartache and struggle, and perhaps even additional financial burdens. It gives them some small modicum of control over something that was previously so uncontrollable. It's much harder to say why one would not welcome all of the new tests, why one might pause. So I want to offer up my own formulation of an argument for why one might pause. This is an argument that can act as a counter or a counterbalance to the understandable and persuasive arguments that prospective parents ought to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or ought to use prenatal testing to learn as much as possible about their embryos or fetuses before they decide whether to proceed with the IVF or proceed with a pregnancy. It's an argument about something that might be lost in taking so much control over reproduction, specifically over who is born. In making this argument, I don't mean to say that the arguments for testing have no merit, and in fact I find them very persuasive. But I think they need to be tempered by some other kinds of values or concerns. In making this argument, I also should note that it stems from my moral intuition, but it is certainly not unfamiliar or unique. Much of what I have developed here, I'm developing around this moral intuition, reflects existing moral theories like virtue ethics, and this is a picture of the 4 cardinal virtues. So that go back to Aristotle. And similar concerns were raised by Heidegger in his concept of Gelassenheit, or Michael Sandel in his critique of hyperagency, or my colleague Eric Parent in his analysis of the rights and obligations of parents. The question that leaps immediately to my mind when I think about using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or prenatal testing to find out everything that we could possibly find out about a child or a fetus. The question I have is, who do I or who do we become when we become the kind of people who choose between embryos or terminate pregnancies based on these kinds of findings? Are we living the values we aspire to hold? On this argument, it might be fine for the child who is eventually born, and I can accept that the embryo that is not selected or the fetus that is not brought to term may not really, in a sense, be harmed, insofar as maybe it doesn't have interests. And perhaps it would be better for society if parents took more control. Maybe we would save a lot of money that way. But I'm asking us to think about the impact that this attitude, taken to this extent, can have on us, on, in a sense, our humanity as both individuals and societies. The question is not, what should I do? The question is, how or who should I be? This argument recognises the link between actions and the self. To some extent, I become who I am through my deeds. The choices I make about what I should do change who I am, just as who I am will impact the choices that I make. They cannot be separated. One way of framing this argument is as being about harm to self. Do I harm myself when I become the kind of person who chooses to terminate a pregnancy because the fetus does not appear to have optimal genes for intelligence? Do I harm myself when I choose to not to transplant an embryo because it is female? Who do I become when I undertake those kinds of actions? Can prospective parents really harm themselves by exercising a lot of control over the parents that they will become and the children that they will go on to have? You may ask what we can do about this, and that's a good question. I would ask you first not to think about what can be banned, what laws can be passed, but about how these concerns can be framed and analysed before deciding which kinds of steps are necessary. But I want to add this argument to the bioethics pot, where it should simmer with all the other arguments related to this area of reproductive ethics. And then we will decide together how, when, and why to intervene in the beginning of life, and how to understand who we become when we choose who should be born.